An American F-35 fighter jet made an emergency landing at a U.S. airbase in the Middle East after being hit by what appeared to be Iranian fire. Sources close to the matter confirmed this to CNN. Even the CENTCOM captain absolutely confirmed it. Captain Tim Hawkins, spokesperson for the U.S. Central Command, stated that this fifth-generation stealth aircraft was on a combat mission over Iran. It was forced to make an emergency landing. According to the captain, it was able to land safely, but the pilot's condition is considered stable. This is the first comment that has been made. Xavier Titelman, you are one of the top specialists in aviation matters. How can we reconstruct what happened?
First, we're dealing with a plane that flies over Iran, as we have a direct image of it. I compared this image to earlier ones using Iranian tracking systems. Basically, these are what we call electro-optical and infrared cameras, which are able to track aerial targets. And the Iranians had already provided this to the Houthis, and the Houthis had already been able to share images. They managed to lock onto the F-35 in flight with this infrared camera, so the image is already relatively credible. Today, it gives the impression of being an original. And what's interesting when we see this explosion is that the explosion itself doesn't destroy the plane. And what further confirms the credibility of this image is that the explosion is very significant. We see the plane, the F-35, with heat coming out from the back of its engine. We see this explosion, and we see the plane continuing to fly afterward, which means that the plane was certainly riddled with impacts because this missile is one that explodes nearby. That is, when it detects that it's less than a meter from its target, it explodes. That sends debris everywhere. They were lucky. The plane wasn't destroyed. The pilot was almost certainly injured by hundreds of flying debris, but still managed to make an emergency landing at the nearest airport.
If confirmed, this would mark the first time since the war began in late February that an American plane was hit by enemy fire over Iranian territory. And this precedent for the American military means something. Especially,
the worst part is we're talking about a plane that's supposed to be stealthy, that stands for air superiority. But stealth, obviously, is simply the ability to reduce an aircraft's radar signature in a very specific frequency band. But we have other systems, and the Iranians have received help from the Chinese, in particular, to be able to lock on visually. And when the Americans fly over areas that are not fully controlled, where, of course, the radars are visible, the radars so the Americans can destroy them. But when it's an infrared camera, it's completely invisible, and no aircraft in the world is stealthy when it comes to heat. And so when you emit heat, you can be detected, and when you can be detected. Using visual tracking, you can launch missiles. That's what, for example, Rafale does with what's called IRST. It's an infrared system that can lock onto targets, and without using its radar, you can launch missiles. That's also what hit the F-35 today, making it a setback for the aircraft's reputation. All right, let's get back to ours.
What is it that, despite the fact that theoretically the Americans could destroy everything that exists, let's say, in terms of control of the Iranian skies, they are still vulnerable? Xavier.
So the real question is, what type of missile hit the F-35 today? At first glance, it's not a heavy, very large system, the way they were destroyed, actually, because they were detected and almost completely destroyed. Here, we're certainly dealing with equipment that is much smaller. So maybe it's a kind of shoulder-fired missile, but we don't know at what altitude this plane was flying. And what surprises me the most in this video is how come the plane itself doesn't deploy any self-protection system. Normally, when a plane detects a launch, just with the heat sensors of the F-35, it should be able to see that there's a missile coming at it. If there's a missile coming at it, it should trigger it's like some kind of fireworks. It's hotter than the plane, or it will release chaff that will create a bigger echo than the aircraft. And in both cases, normally the plane can protect itself and avoid the missile hitting it. Here it appears the plane didn't detect it was targeted or that a missile was incoming, raising many questions about the F-35's protection system effectiveness. And then, in general, we know that air supremacy doesn't exist, but the Americans have still boasted about being able to fly almost freely over Iranian territory. So air supremacy is not guaranteed. The Americans don't have superiority when it comes to interception, ballistic missile defense, or defense against kamikaze drones. So here we're really looking at a series of technological failures that call everything into question. Also, the swagger that Trump wants to showcase and the show of force he wants to demonstrate.
This obviously contrasts with Trump's side, which is always a bit of wishful thinking. On the very same day he's in the Oval Office and he says, no, nobody shoots at us. Listen,
We have practically destroyed everything, including their command structures. Their navy has disappeared. Their air force, their anti-aircraft equipment have disappeared. We fly wherever we want. Nobody shoots at us.
Michel Goyard.
Yes, of course, it's not a great look, but no.
But with the military, things go faster. You see, you make a 4-minute, 50-second sentence and he says, it looks bad. We get it.
Well, yes, when you talk on the radio, you have to give orders very quickly. And no. So first of all, this F-35 being hit, it's an incident. I mean, it's not dramatic either, but it's still definitely a bad point, a negative point. And basically, Donald Trump, he can rack up only a certain number of negative points, right? And after a while, well, too much is too much, right? So the worst negative points are obviously if there are casualties. So that's already happened, at least twice. Those are blunders. The Minab school smashed by a Tomahawk, schoolgirls massacred by an American Tomahawk.
With children killed as a result.
So that there too, it's really bad to say the least, and so on, incidents and so on. And so, yes, after a while, it shouldn't pile up too much. Otherwise, people will say, okay, but we're stuck in a quagmire, in a mess, and so on, which is not the case. It's important to remember that. We're still very far from all that. But here we are. We're in a standoff that might last for months, probably months, actually. And that's it. There will be more incidents like this. It's not very serious, but it can definitely encourage things. It'll come back. We'll talk about it again, I think, later on. Donald Trump wants something, wants to make a splash, wants to do something to reverse the trend and say, okay, here is the problem with this war. Carrying out strikes, doing 350 strikes a day. Okay, but it's abstract, actually. It's abstract. It's mathematical. We look at the numbers, the missiles, the drones. Well, okay, but it's not a flag planted somewhere. It's not something, it's not the raid on Caracas. It's not something that leaves a mark on people's minds.
And since you were talking about credibility, there's this kind of point system where President Trump can't afford to lose too many points. What's starting to get worse is the possible entry of Saudi Arabia into the war. For now, maybe it's just posturing, but it's an economic powerhouse in the region, and above all, a military power as well. An $80 billion budget, more than France's.
More military investments than we have.
How many soldiers?
That's the question. There's an A-troop shortage.
He has a lot of equipment.
Not much. They have plenty of money, but not many troops. Is that it? To wage a war?
It's like underestimating the Saudis. Still, listen to their side. They're capable of subduing the Houthis. They fought a war against the Houthis. After all, it has to be said, listen to them. Have they evolved militarily since then? In any case, tonight they say, we do not rule out entering the war.
As we have clearly stated, we reserve the right to take military action if it becomes necessary.
If the time comes, the leadership of the kingdom...
And when the time comes, the leaders of the kingdom will make the necessary decision. We will not hesitate to protect our country and our economic resources.
That was the announcement by Foreign Minister Saud. And look at this clip that was produced, because they may not have very capable troops. I'm not a judge, but just in case. They have a communications office that must be running at full capacity as usual. And this is the clip that was produced today to show that Saudi Arabia is ready to show its strength.
It's an army that has learned a bit from its mistakes in two ways. The first is that in 2019 there was a strike by low-cost Iranian drones on Aramco facilities, which is the Saudi oil giant. That was a time when we should have learned from low-cost drones ourselves, but it took Ukraine for us to learn that. The second area where they invested is air defense, especially in American THAAD systems and Patriot systems. They have one of the most significant air defense systems in the region. Their weak point is that they have a mass army with more than 1,500 tanks and hundreds of artillery pieces. But when it comes to ballistic missiles, for example, they are far behind Iran. If there were a war against Iran, they would lack deep strike capabilities against Iran. They have 400 fighter jets, but the question is how many pilots, and especially the pilots are inexperienced. The war against the Houthis, we could easily make fun of them, but we also struggled with asymmetric warfare. The Americans, the French, we had a hard time, but their air force is underexperienced.
What's your take on this as well, Xavier Teitelman? The Saudis, to put it a bit bluntly, hate the Iranians, and the feeling is mutual, at least politically speaking. If they went to war, what resources would they use?
They could almost double the military potential in the area, very clearly because they actually have F-15s, bombers, Eurofighters. They have Tornadoes, so all of that adds up to more than 350 operational aircraft. The real question is whether they have enough pilots to get them all in the air at once. But on the other hand, they do have munitions, so if they only target the ballistic and drone launch capabilities of the Saudis, the Iranians, then they really have the potential to help the American-Israeli force. But the more political question is whether they will side with the Israelis against the Iranians, which is problematic. Militarily, this force has mostly shown it can't manage even simple operations, including basic bombing missions on Houthi territory. They had poor aim, they didn't have accurate intelligence, they made mistakes, and they weren't able to coordinate several planes at the same time to carry out complex missions, which is the basic expectation from an air force that is so well equipped. So there will really be an unknown, won't there? The Americans will assign them simple, clear missions with well-defined tasks, making them a valuable support.
Sarah Safri, how would the Iranian people feel about it? That is to say, this time, not only Israel and the United States, but also Saudi Arabia would be striking Iranian territory. Thank you.
I think that would also change the course of the war, because we don't know what they would strike, we don't know which targets they would hit. Whereas the so-called war aim of Israel was to strike the repressive regime that boasts about it and puts it to death. For 47 years, the Americans, their war aim was to hit the nuclear facilities. Now, if they get involved, we don't know what they'll want to target. So we'll also have to be careful about that. And that's another war that could start, the war between Sunnis and Shiites. If they get involved too, and that's something else entirely.
The expansion of the war, we have a map to basically sum up just how far it could go. There are several ways to count, depending on whether the countries, let's say, are involved, have received, like Oman, a certain number of drones or not. But when you look at this map, there's something quite terrifying. The Middle East has entered the war with, obviously, Israel and Iran, and the United States, but also the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia.
It's about time we stop talking about the Iran war. This is the third Gulf War. Besides, for Europeans and Americans, the focus is mainly on what's happening in the Gulf, from Hormuz to Karg Island, for example. And when we also look at what the real next issues in this region are, we're talking about Saudi Arabia, which is leaving the United Arab Emirates tomorrow. At the very least, will they freeze the billions of Iranian assets on their soil? Or will they too, who have a very large air force, eventually start taking a harder line? At this point, I think it's no longer just an Israeli-American war with Iran. When France finally starts seriously considering reinforcing our bases to avoid another casualty tomorrow, we can see what the future of this conflict holds.